I think one of the most important things is this book is looking at the experience of beauty, not for the sake of pleasure, which is a great reason to enjoy beauty, not for the sake of decoration, but really as an important and necessary and wholly unique tool to increase our agency in our world, our connection to the world around us, the people around us, our communities. And that's a really important thing for me in the book, because the whole struggle that I'm sort of dealing with is figuring out how to be more present in my own life.
Welcome, everybody. We thank Boswell Bookshop here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for hosting this interview with Porchlight Book Company. I'm Sally Halderson, Managing Director at Porchlight in Milwaukee also. We have the honor today of welcoming Chloé Cooper Jones. Chloé is a philosophy professor and freelance journalist who was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. Her work has appeared in publications including GQ, The Verge, Vice, Book Forum, New York Magazine, and The Believer. She lives in Brooklyn with her family. And in her new book, Easy Beauty, a Memoir, she documents her experiences traveling, mothering, teaching, experiences all girded and informed by living in a disabled body. Chloé will now gift us with her insight and presence, and we are very excited to talk to her about her new book, Easy Beauty. Hi, Chloé.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited for today's conversation because much of what you wrote in Easy Beauty, disability, motherhood, identity, has also been critical to my life. And we have a lot to go deep on today, and we will. But first, I'd like to start out with kind of a softball or maybe a tennis ball. I'm a diehard tennis nerd. I love nothing more than the first few days of a tennis tournament when you get to see all the players, learn about their background stories, compare their game styles. It's like eating your fill from the richest, most varied dessert cart. And I know that you came to tennis late, maybe slightly unwillingly, but also then fell in love with many parts of the game, including Roger Federer's. And you write about this in your book. And if we can start out with, how did you come to write about tennis? And how does Roger Federer's game help us become introduced to the concepts of beauty in this book?
Great question. I'm so glad to know that you're also a tennis fan. You didn't tell me that ahead of time, so we have really so much in common.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I've written about a lot of different things over the course of my career, my academic career, and then also my career as a journalist. So I think that the thread, if you were to sort of try hard to connect, why I wanted to write about all these very different types of things is, I think in general, I'm really fascinated by just the act of looking and how the act of looking can be complicated. And so one of the most fascinating experiences for me, and one of my favorite experiences, is when I'm looking at something that seems initially very opaque or like difficult to understand. So perhaps that's, in my experience, that's been like an abstract painting that I can't quite understand the value of right away. Or sometimes it's a really complicated piece of music that I can't hear all the complexities of. And also it's things like tennis. So when I came to watch tennis as a novice, I would be like, why does anybody watch this sport? I don't understand. Like, it's so boring. It's just two people hitting a ball over a net. And like sometimes the ball goes out, and that's good for somebody. Like, it just seemed like the world's most boring sport. But I would watch it with this friend of mine, and he was an unbelievable like tennis fan, like just and really smart about the game. And he could literally see things that I couldn't see, right? So he could read a serve, meaning like he could predict what serve the server was going to use before. I didn't even know there were multiple types of serves. I thought you just threw the ball and you hit it and that's it. But of course, no, there's lots of different types of serves. And he could predict things and he could see points building to a conclusion. And I was so fascinated by that because part of me was just jealous that he got to have a perceptual experience that I couldn't have. And so whenever I have that sort of opaque perceptual experience, I find, and this is what I love so much about it, and what I love so much about our strange and powerful human brains, is that I found that every time I would learn a little bit more about a thing, or be guided by an expert through a thing, or read about a thing, or just be patient and observant about a thing, it would slowly reveal itself. And that would happen when I would look at a complicated painting or sculpture or listen to music. And it also happened with tennis. And so it just became such an incredible experience for me. I really fell in love with the game because over time and through increasing my sort of, just knowledge base, I literally started to see differently. And that gave me that's just a great joy. It just made me feel so, I think that's a uniquely human thing to be able to do, to use reason, rationality, information, knowledge to increase our sensory perceptions. So that's what I really fell in love with. And then with Roger Federer, he's, often known to be one of the most elegant, sort of graceful players. And he is, and watching him play is quite powerful, and it is like an emotional experience, and it's definitely an experience of beauty. But I became really fascinated to try to figure out why it was that I liked it so much. And I think that part of it is that he makes the game look effortless. And on one side, I think when beauty is effortless, that can be kind of a negative thing. I think that has a negative connotation in a way, because what it can say to other people is like, if you have to work hard at something, you're doing it wrong. And I don't like that. I don't like any sort of worship of effortlessness in genius or talent or anything. It's like, I think that erases people's hard work, and people who struggle feel like they're more and more behind. So that's kind of like the negative side of that, is like beauty or artistry is effortless. But then I think the positive side, and this was something a journalist said to me, is he said, I was saying, why do you, and this is in the book, I said, why do you like Roger Federer? Or why do you think it's so beautiful to watch him? And he said, because life is so hard. Yep. And sometimes it's just nice to see things go right. And I really think about that all the time. It's like, sometimes it's actually just quite cathartic to see someone do something so well, and for things to just be executed correctly. And he was like, our lives are just so hard. So that's a sort of dual-edged nature of Federer's particular version of beauty as effortlessness. I think it has a tension to it. And that, of course, is always fascinating material for a writer.
It's a fascinating, when you think, there's a great part for the people who have not yet read Chloé's book, and I'm sure you're going to be reading it soon, but there's a great scene where Chloé's describing some of the Roger Federer fans who are maybe not putting quite as much analysis into why they are so in love with Roger, but at the same time you felt a communal experience with these other fans, because they are experiencing this sort of sublime moment for themselves. And it's a very fun chapter in the book. So we're going to move along sort of in that same vein and say that you were writing about Iris Murdoch's critique of Kant, and you paraphrase her, and I'm going to quote your line here. Beauty, Murdoch argues, gave us an opportunity for an unselfing. That's a through line in this book, that beauty can take us out of ourselves through admiring or pursuing admission to beauty. One's inner lens shifts, which is sort of a key transformational quotient in your narrative. You write, by paying attention to beauty, I could break free of myself, clear my mind of selfish care, change my consciousness, tune it toward life with others. How do you see that work? And how does beauty take us out of ourselves? And why do we wish or even need that?
Yeah. Well, so just as a sort of background of the book, each chapter takes place in a different city across the world. And in each chapter, I'm seeking out an experience of beauty. And I think the term beauty, of course, is so fascinating because we can use it in so many different ways, right? Obviously, we call people or bodies beautiful, but We also speak of nature. The natural world is beautiful. We look at fine art in museums and call it beautiful. But also, like, I just ate a beautiful meal with my friends earlier. I call my dog beautiful. I call ideas beautiful. I even can call failures beautiful, or risks that people have taken. I'll be like, oh, what a beautiful risk, and it paid off or it didn't. And so that term, it's like when we use it, philosophers are very interested in, like, what is the thing we're actually tracking when we say that word, when we say it about people and sunsets and roses and tunes and paintings and dogs and, like what's actually the thing we're tracking. And what one philosopher came up with as an answer, and I think it's a really beautiful answer, is a feeling of kinship with that thing that sort of gives us a feeling of connection. And I think, if you've had a really strong experience of beauty, it can feel like, well, so this philosopher thinks like it's your part of your soul is like activated. It's like recognizing itself tangibly in the world. This is Plotinus who says this. And I think that's such a relatable feeling. Like when I'm in the presence of something really stunning, when I see a really beautiful sunset or something, my body responds to it. I feel like, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I feel a thrill. Maybe my adrenaline goes a little bit. My eyes widen. I might breathe in a little heavier. Like there is this sort of bodily sensory reaction. So what is that thing? And I really love this idea of it being kinship, that we're connecting. And so Iris Murdoch, she sort of takes that idea and moves it a little further down the canon of philosophy and develops this idea that you quoted so beautifully of unselfing, where she just says simply, if we want to change our minds about something, we need to change our concepts. So how do we actually change our concepts of the world or of ideas or other people? And she says that necessarily we have to get outside of our own perspective in order to do that. She has some great language around this. She says we have to sort of break free of our palace of self-regard, which I think is like such a perfect phrase. And she says beauty, the experience of beauty in the world can do that for us because, just as I was saying before, it requires us to move outside of our own perspective and feel a connection to something outside of ourselves, whether it is the natural world that surrounds us, the beauty of communication with another person, or art that's made by another mind that then you're in a communion with. And she says when we have that experience of beauty in the world, we can return, we like get free of our palace of self-regard, but then we can return to ourselves with a new perspective. It's like we've absorbed a little bit more of the world and then we bring it back with us. And that can really help us change our perspectives. And I think we've all probably had an experience where reading a really incredible book or seeing a really powerful film, we will feel like our consciousness shift sometimes. And so I think the experience of, I think one of the most important things is this book is looking at the experience of beauty, not for the sake of pleasure, which is a great reason to enjoy beauty, not for the sake of decoration, but really as an important and necessary and wholly unique tool to increase our agency in our world, our connection to the world around us, the people around us, our communities. And that's a really important thing for me in the book, because the whole struggle that I'm sort of dealing with is figuring out how to be more present in my own life. Right. And so I use Iris Murdoch's theory as a hopeful way to change my own bad concepts.
I think that as you were talking, I kept noting these communion and kinship and change as being really key words that really sort of float above the narrative of the story. And you very deliberately build a distinction between your life away from others, holding people at a distance, and then your life with others, building a life together, and using your word kinship. What had been familiar to you was to live a life in which you, as a disabled person, had been observed, made an object for comment or opinion, and that you developed sort of a reserve to stand away from people expecting or anticipating rejection for your disability. But you move out of your neutral room, as you called it, the calming mental space you created in your mind to escape, where you could be absent even in the presence of people. To be fully engaged with people, putting down your defenses, is where we end up as we read through your story. Is that how you intended the book to be read? And do you feel that writing this book has given you a place to pay respect to that younger version of yourself, but then honor the person you've become since?
Yeah. And what a beautifully, you really synthesized the book, I think, so beautifully. I'm really grateful for that question and your synthesis. Yeah, I have. So I should just say, for people who haven't read the book, there's this word, this term that I use, the neutral room. And it's actually literally a pain management technique that I was taught at a very young age by a doctor. I have a physical disability called sacral agenesis, and it comes with some physical attributes. I'm much shorter than the average woman. And I also walk with a very pronounced side-to-side gait. So I'm very visually disabled. Maybe not on Zoom, you can't tell so well, but if you were in the room with me, or if I was walking near you, you would immediately, be able to tell. So it also comes with a pain disorder. So I've always been involved in pain management, fatigue management. So when I was really young, the doctor taught me this technique, which I learned later that long distance athletes use a very similar technique, which makes perfect sense to me. And it is that you find a place in your mind and you go into that. And my doctor was like, make it a room that always looks the same. So this is why it's called the neutral room, because it's just white walls. It's a white cube. And I go into this space. I imagine myself moving into this space. And in the space in my mind, I don't have a body. I'm only a brain, and I'm floating painlessly in the space. And then he told me, now count to 8. And he'd say, you're not in pain for the day. You're not in pain for the whole walk, to the subway. You're only in pain for 8 seconds at a time, and you can handle that. And then, of course, the pain, the 8 seconds repeats. But I found long distance athletes do this thing too, where they're like, I'm not running 26 miles. I'm only running to that tree. I'm only running to that bench. And so it's a way of sort of tricking your brain not to feel the anxiety of the pain to come. So this was a very powerful mechanism for managing pain. But of course, what I could find is that I could also use it as a tool for managing social discomfort. I could use it as a way of avoiding my reality, and I could sort of dissociate and stay in this mental space, including, as you put so perfectly, even though I seemed present or even though I was with other people. My hope is that that's something that seems actually quite identifiable and like recognizable to people. I think all of us have a version of a neutral room, whatever it is. We all, in a letter from my father, he said simply, where do you go to escape the pain of reality? And for him, it was drinking. And for me, it's this sort of abstracted mental space that kept me safe and protected, but always apart. So a lot of the struggle of the book is me trying to reconcile the fact that this neutral room is in fact a very useful and necessary tool. Like we all need a space to go to retreat. And this neutral room was also a place in which I did a lot of thinking and I did a lot of writing and I did a lot of things that I'm really proud of and that I love. But the struggle is to find that threshold where that retreat becomes an avoidance of reality or just simply an inability to feel present or feel any communion with anyone else. And of course, the thing that really changes for me is because I wasn't very critical about this my entire adult life until I had a son. And I realized, okay, you can actually parent from a dissociated space. You can try, but it's going to have this very tangible negative effect on your child. And I was seeing it. And so to see my own worst behaviors reflected back to me by my young son, I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, well, I'm not living a life worthy of him. So I have to, maybe I'm fine. I can dissociate and not get close to people, but I can't let that happen to him. And so the book is really this attempt to not lose the agency of the neutral room or lose the power of peace, getting breaks and peace, but to find that threshold where it can become bad and stay on the right side of it.
I think everyone listening must be relating to that in one way or another, even if they have not had been introduced to that particular technique. I'm interested in whether, as you mentioned, the construction of the book is you travel to different cities in each chapter. And is that another form of this distancing, and how that was intentional for where you come to at the end of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's intentional. I wanted to, in order to sort of make this shift, I wanted to get away from my family. I wanted to go as far as I could. And I think part of it was that I knew I couldn't work through this problem in front of them. And I think also it was like I was just scared to work through this problem in front of them. And there was a restlessness in me that wanted to just escape having to reconcile these parts of myself, because, and I think this is an identifiable feeling for a lot of parents. It's like, you do have to some extent, say goodbye to an old self. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways, like, I wanted to mourn that old self, and I wanted to sort of feel the loss of that old, like, self, which I'm glad she's gone, because it's like not a healthy version of myself, but still was me, and very recognizably me, as a very protected and withdrawn person, but had been the only person I'd ever known of myself. So the travel I think does a couple things. One, it gives me the space to sort of deal with this. But two, the whole sort of goal, and this relates to what we were talking about with Iris Murdoch, is how do I just learn to be physically, mentally, emotionally in the world and with others? Mm-hmm. And I think part of that was like, I had to go put my body physically, like literally put my body in places where I didn't think it would be received well, and I didn't think it would belong, because what I needed to do was like, just deal with all that and like face it and really think about the moments that I would feel like people were unkind, or the moments where I'd feel uncomfortable, the moments where I would recognize how little was accessible for me, the moments where I would struggle and be in pain. Like, nothing was going to shift in me unless I faced all that head on. And so I think part of it was just like a crash course, and just really saying, okay, I'm going to go be aggressively present, kind of. It's like shock therapy almost.
Yeah.
And it was extremely helpful. But then also the structure of the book is a quest. And so any sort of classic quest, the hero has to leave home in search of new knowledge. And then the hope is that the hero returns home with that new knowledge and is able to use it to make home a better place. So that was a very intentional part of the structuring of the craft of the book.
Oh, we're hitting on all of these things that I am so excited to talk about. I'm going to jump down to a question, because I think it dovetails a little better with what you were just talking about, because one of, this reads to me as a transformational memoir, but it can also be read as a hero's journey. It can also be read as it has elements of the confessional. But in terms of transformation, in any transformational memoir that we read, there is a moment when the character can finally see clearly, whether it's a visit to a guru or a near-death experience. And while becoming a mother was obviously significant for you in lots of ways, for me, it was an incident with your son, Wolfgang, that was a turning point, at least emblematically. He was a curious young boy. For those people who haven't read the book, he was a curious young boy, puts himself in a spot of danger. And because of your physical disability, you're not able to reach him and rescue him from this moment. And the perception of danger in this moment. A stranger, like so many before, judges you for your apparent inability to adequately care for your son. In that scene, though, you actually find a sense of comfort in what you're most accustomed to, which is the judgment and which is the anger. And yet it's the first time you reflect back to us that your anger at your observers, your judges, and your outlook on life could become imprinted on your son and might perhaps be more dangerous to him than your physical restrictions. I might be going too far with that one.
That's right. I think the exact thing. Yeah.
You write, quote, "I am right to be angry. I am right to be afraid. And that was how I lived my life. And maybe that was a good enough life for me, but it wasn't a good enough life for Wolfgang." As you already addressed this a little bit earlier, but did you also realize that maybe that wasn't good enough for you either, and that you too deserved more than that judgment and that resultant anger?
Yeah. And, I think in that scene, I talk about how we're at this we're on a family vacation, a very beautiful lake, and I'm kind of ruining the whole vacation because I'm kind of cynically looking for the experience of being out of place or someone telling me I'm out of place. And it's like, because I'm looking for it, I'm already ruining the good moments. And then when I find it, instead of even a feeling of, I think, yes, I do feel anger and resentment when this, stranger judges me. But I think the even stronger feeling is like, there, I was right. There it was.
Right.
I was waiting. And then there's a moment where I want to pull Wolfgang to me and say, we are going to be in this little bubble together. We're going to be united against the world, but safe together. And I think that as a parent is such a strong but bad temptation, right? To be like, the world is bad and we'll just, hole up and not experience it. And I think I had that really strong temptation. And then that really scared me because I thought, no, I don't want that for him. I don't want him to be looking around for strangers to be cruel. I want him to be critical. I want him to be thoughtful. I want him to be independent, but I don't want him to have all those things at the sake of community or camaraderie. And so in the same trip, it was right around Christmas. And I actually can't even remember if this is in the book or not. I think it is, but it's the same trip. There was a Santa Claus, and the Santa Claus says to like a guy, and he says to my son, come over here and do you want a picture and all this stuff. My son was only like 5 at the time, and says, why don't you tell me what you want for Christmas? And my son went, nah, I know you're a guy in a suit, and he just was so. Don't worry. He was like, don't worry, don't do that. I know you're just some random suit. And I mean, this was at 5 years old. Like, he was so deeply cynical. And I thought, he missed out on the whole joy of believing in Santa or the Easter Bunny or all these sorts of things. And I didn't tell him that, but I wasn't like, Santa's not a thing. I hope no kids are watching this. Spoiler alert. I never said that. Like, I never said that to him, but my general disposition in the world was to look at people and go, what's your deal? So he was just mimicking my behavior. And so those sorts of moments they are really big turning points. And then I think that the moment that kind of comes right after that, and that's part of the classic quest, is the meeting with a mentor, right? The mentor that really shifts you. I think I have a lot of meetings with the mentors, Wolfgang, the senior, just talking about being one, but then also my mother in the next chapter says to me, like, you're always looking at the wrong hurt, and that was such an important lesson. She's like, you're always reading into the wrong hurt and looking for the wrong pain. Like, you're never seeing these things quite clearly. And so those moments really begin to shift who I can become. And I think, sorry, just to answer, I think your question of like, am I now getting the life that I deserve? I think the truth is like, you really can't change anything for your children unless you genuinely change it for yourself. So I think this idea of what I deserve and what Wolfgang deserved, as soon as he was born, those things were forever connected.
Right.
And can't ever be separated. And I can't just actually live for him alone, because it doesn't work. It's like, I actually have to be somebody that is open, and I have to be someone who's warm and not always so cynical that it cuts people down before they get to be themselves. And only that will help him be that as well.
That reminds me of a line that has really resonated for me from the book. You have been hearkening back to the tennis section, but you were talking about, you were telling the story of being brave enough to ask a question in an interview. And you were nervous to the point of like near paralysis or maybe verbal paralysis. But in that instant, you were incredibly forgiving to yourself, acknowledging that. And the quote that the anxiety and fear is deep in the core of being a person. You are the thing standing in your way, which I think speaks to what you were just talking about, that until, there are lots of sayings, you can't pour from an empty cup or something like that. But unless you get your head in the right space, you can't possibly be either modeling or experiencing that life as a parent from that space. And that feels, I'd love to know a little bit more about, how often that thing that stands in the way of what we generally want or need really is developed mechanisms or defenses. And how that, it's just another line that I'm remembering from the book where you say that you're so intrigued, and this is not going to be a quote, I'm going to paraphrase you on this one, but just so interested in figuring out what it means to be human. And those two things seem very tied together to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're often collaborators with the world on our blocks, on our obstacles. Not always, things do happen to people, but I think a lot of times day to day, we're collaborators. And what I mean by that is I did experience people's cruelty. I did experience, and I do experience people's lowered expectations. The disabled life can be often a very isolating one because a lot of the time, or at least for myself, my disability isn't hereditary. So I didn't come from a culture. I didn't learn how to be disabled from my mother. I didn't pass it on to my son. My husband isn't disabled. Most of my friends are not disabled. And so it's like there's sort of a knowledge or cultural isolation. But then also, I still think we're very, very far behind narratively about how to really talk about disability and represent disabled lives. Quite often, if you pick up a book or watch a movie that has a disabled character in it, that character will not have much agency, be desexualized, be like childlike and angelic, or evil and sort of malevolent, depending on your sort of genre, and will quite often die at the end so that the able-bodied people can see how valuable life is. It's sort of the Beth in Little Women model, right? Like all the other sisters get to be real, full women with desires, love lives, and then complicated problems. And Beth is, spoiler alert, if people haven't read Little Women, but Beth is just like perfect and angelic and lovely, and everyone loves her. And then she dies, and everyone's like, "Oh, now our lives can start." And that's really, those are the narratives I grew up with, and so
Right.
it becomes an extremely difficult thing to see outside of that, if that's all, what you're internalizing. So I just want to say, like you mentioned that scene where I'm scared to ask a question to Roger Federer, but the way that scene ends is, but I do, right?
You do it.
And I'm really anxious, and I'm saying to myself, like, people are going to laugh at me, or people are going to think I'm an idiot. So again, I'm collaborating, right? It's like I'm helping create this obstacle, but I actually do, then I speak. And that comes, about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the book. But the first scene of the book is me with two men at a bar who are arguing about whether my life is worth living. And I don't speak, right? So I collaborate so hard with this obstacle or this fear of how I'm going to be judged or perceived that it keeps me silent. So when you talk about like the transformative memoirs, I think this book is really just me. My whole life doesn't radically change. I'm not some magically integrated person now, but I do move to the ability to still be fearful, to still have, worry, to still have struggle, but to push through it a little bit or push against it, and to recognize the ways in which I'm making it worse by collaborating with other people's worst ideas about me. So yeah, I hope that feels actually quite identifiable to people. That is not a thing that's specific to disability. I think that's a very human thing. And I think we can't not be human, but we can be self-aware, a little bit more self-aware, and thus have a little bit more control over those moments in which we're making the obstacle bigger ourselves. We are the things in our way.
That's so good. I had not connected that first scene to the sort of voice and agency scene, and that perhaps distracted by the tennis, but then also, seeing that change at the end of the book, which we'll hold off for a little bit on that one.
Won't spoil the ending.
No, yes, we've got so many spoilers already here. But I'm usually fairly reticent to talk too much about myself in these interviews, but I think because we are talking about giving voice, and we are talking about relating and kinship and community, that I mentioned at the beginning of the introduction that a lot of what you talk about in the book is a big part of my life as well. And while my experience is different in a number of kinds of ways, there's a lot of, I'm going to say loaded, even though that sounds a little bit heavy, but like loaded material here that I can't quite, that I think is worth acknowledging, because I know as a writer, you want to know that you're reaching the people who need to hear, need to hear, maybe that's strong too, but can resonate with what you're saying. And so for me, I was born with an infection in the femur of my left leg, and that caused my left side to grow more slowly than the rest of my body. If I had not had a bunch of surgeries as a kid, my left leg would be about 5 or 6 inches shorter than my right, and I'd be in a wheelchair and various other things. I have a constant limp, but because of those surgeries, most people don't, notice that my left leg is constructed differently than my right. And I have kind of yet to understand for myself whether I identify as someone with a disability. If it can't be seen, and I can say, I can walk with some discomfort and play a somewhat ugly game of club tennis, then I truly claim that identity. And yet the pain and loneliness I felt as a child is very real, and the effort it takes to upkeep my body's mobility and pain level now is as well. And there are a lot of people who suffer from chronic pain that can't be seen, pain from childhood injuries or things that they needed to have treated, and their disabilities are hidden from the world. And so I'm very interested in what your perspective on disability as identity, but also how visible and invisible disability differs in terms of identity.
That's a great question. I would say, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I obviously didn't know that before, and seeing you on Zoom, it's hard to know. And I'm really, really glad that you told me, but also I hope that there were things in the book that resonated because of that.
Exactly.
I certainly don't speak for the entirety of the disability community, because it's a very vast community, but I do think a couple things are important to me. One is, in my experience, the disability community is extremely inclusive and welcoming and open, and wants more than anything for people to communicate about the ways that they interact, basically like the ways that their selves, their minds, and their bodies are in a very, very complex relationship, but then also how those connections represent socially, right? So the social dynamic and also the internal dynamic. So I think it's really important if you're saying, because of these things, I had a different childhood, or because of these things, I had a different relation to other people, like that's a disability experience. And it's really, that's a crucial thing to think about, and to think about how we talk about those things and to be open about those things. Quickly, I think it's very interesting the way that physical disability, like visible, recognizable physical disability and hidden disabilities interact, and they interact in a really interesting sort of spectrum of privilege and also prejudice. So I can't, if I'm walking around in public, I can't pass as not disabled, right? I can't go on a date or go to the grocery store or anything like that and not be like a disabled person. And that means that I've had a certain stigma that's reflected back to me all the time, my whole life. And that's not always my favorite thing in the world. But I have a really important privilege, which is nobody questions my disability and nobody gaslights me about it.
Right.
So my friends who have chronic illness, or my friends who've had hard to diagnose illnesses, my friends who are neurodivergent, they will talk a lot about what, like the interaction of the body and the social sphere is often one of disbelief or condescension or absolute gaslighting or worse, and I have to say, like, this is a privilege of mine. I go to a doctor and they go, oh yeah, you don't have a sacrum, and that's messes all that stuff up, and that's it. So there's something very definitive about that's given me a certain type of peace. But then maybe the ability for my friends to pass, going to the grocery store gives them a certain type of peace. So I think those things are just really importantly different, but in a good dialogue together. And then the last thing that I want to say about this is, and again, it might be that lots of people in the disability community don't agree with this, although I think it's not a particularly controversial thing to say, is that my ideal in talking about disability and writing about disability is to remind people that they are always themselves, regardless of how they identify, in a relationship to illness and disability, because at any moment you can get sick. I mean, for the last couple of years, that's all we've been thinking about. And at any moment you can become disabled. You can have an accident or an illness that creates disability. You can enter that community literally at any moment. And if you're really lucky and you get to live a long life, you're absolutely going to feel your physical, mental, emotional capabilities shift and change. And so rather than thinking of us as this sort of strange other class of people that we are or aren't allowed to identify with, my ideal is to say we're all on a spectrum of relationship to disability, every single one of us. And the ideal thing would be for us to get some peace and self-awareness and critical thought about that, because there's no way you're going to live your whole life, no matter how healthy you are, without an experience of disability or illness. So let's get, this should be a strength of the community. It should feel like these issues are relevant to all of us. And I think in some ways people are thinking about it a little differently after COVID or long COVID, or just feeling how vulnerable we've all felt for the last few years. I think that can't help but shift the way people think about disability. So that's my very long-winded way of saying, like, welcome, identify,
Yes.
I think it'd be great to talk to you about how you feel about disability in your own life.
Yes. I am fortunate in many ways to have a trio of, I have 3 people in my family, and we would all identify as disabled. My husband had leukemia, stem cell transplant, and is disabled as a result. I have a son who's cognitively and physically disabled. So we have all of the pieces that make up a particular prism with which I see this topic. And you touched on a lot of the questions that I had remaining about accessibility and whether we've come any distance at all in less othering when it comes to disability. And particularly perhaps in the United States, in relationship to where all of the places that you have traveled. And because we have such a culture of success and independence, right? Like there's such a value of independence. And then when we talk about people who are very much dependent either upon the system that can support them or the people in their lives that can support them. And in your experience of being a mother and Wolfgang's experience of having a disabled mother and my experience of having a disabled child, like all of this informs the way that we interact with the world, and as well as sort of, I suppose, connect ourselves to the true essence of being human. Yeah. Which often, unfortunately, comes down to pain or emotional growth or any of those kinds of things. And I think that the true, like the very depth of this book brings that to the surface in a way that is we're all willing to engage with. And that's a gift for us to see, no matter where you might be on that spectrum of ability.
Gosh, that's such a beautiful thing to say to me. Thank you. Thank you.
There's so many things, and I'm just glancing at the clock, and
I know we've run really late.
we have a little more time, and I do really. I mean, I've got things about your mother, and I've got things about your father, but I do want to return back to beauty. And the reason why I do on the end of this discussion about disability is because there is a beauty that can be reached when we truly connect on a level of humanity that most of us aren't willing to do on a daily basis, right? And the true, like, this is what it means to be alive. And this is what it means to have value in being an alive human on that spectrum of ability. And I can't believe we haven't even had time to talk about Sharon and Beyonce, which is another favorite part of the book. So everybody who is tuning in, please read the book. But I do want to return to the concept of beauty. You offer a distinction between easy beauty and difficult beauty. And easy beauty, Bosanquet, am I going to say that correctly?
Bernard Bosanquet, yeah.
Says that easy beauty is apparent and unchallenging, while difficult beauty requires more time and patience. And I'm curious why you named the book Easy Beauty, when by all accounts here, you've gone through life thinking and feeling that to connect to people, they would have to engage in something more akin to difficult beauty that includes intricacy, tension, width. So why easy beauty, and how does that represent a change, I think, in how you perceived yourself in the world?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, yes, I can't believe time has gone by so fast. Your questions have been so brilliant, and we'll have to do a part 2 someday.
Part 2.
Because I could talk to you forever, but I do think this is sort of a perfect way to end, because it lets me talk about a little bit of the end of the book without ruining anything for readers. But, so this idea of Bosanquet's, that there's certain key, and to be clear, like he, as a philosopher, doesn't say that one type of beauty is better than the other. He just says that certain types of beauty arrive to us really quickly, like a sunset, like a rose, like a simple song that you go, oh, you feel it right away. And those are really wonderful experiences. And then other types of beauties are just more challenging. Kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about certain types of things being opaque and requiring more time and patience, effort, knowledge, education to really recognize their intricacy. Now, if you are a disabled woman whose body is not always seen immediately as beautiful, this idea of difficult beauty is kind of a good theory for you, right? Like it's right. And I could kind of use it as like a protective theory where I would go,
right.
Well, I'm a worthy an important and beautiful, wonderful person, you just got to think about it a little while longer. You got to like look.
You do the work.
Yeah, you have to do some work. You have to be more, you have to be more educated. And honestly, that became such a helpful theory that it was, as you said, like it could be used as a defense mechanism. Mm-hmm. And I also I use it so intensely as a defense mechanism that I started in my life to only prioritize or really see value or give proper due to the types of beauty in my life that were difficult. So I only wanted to read the hardest things. I studied really difficult subjects. I wanted to look at really complicated art forms. And I thought, if I'm not really stretching my mind or working in this sort of realm, then it's not worth it. And so I could be quite cynical or skeptical of beauty that came quickly or arrived to me quickly or hit me quickly. And I could see it as somehow lesser. Now, again, that's me. That's my bad usage of Bosanquet's theory. And it was because the difficult beauty, holding true to that and sort of looking down my nose at easy beauty, was again this sort of protective thing. Mm-hmm. And so the book, part of the book's arc is trying to write and appreciate and see with the same amount of reverence and love and seriousness the moments of easy beauty in my life, such as the incredibly easy beauty of loving my child and being with my family, or taking a walk with him, with my son on a beautiful afternoon in Brooklyn. And so the very beginning of the book has me analyzing a Bernini sculpture in Rome, but the very, very last passage of the book, and the last couple of passages, are me writing with the same intensity and study and reverence about just the sound of my husband making coffee in the morning. And so the ability to allow easy beauty into my life, and I think partially to say that I'm worthy of it and that I deserve it. Yeah. And that I don't need to be cynical and I don't need these defense mechanisms. That's the goal. So in some ways the title's aspirational, can I find peace with those moments of incredible easy beauty?
That makes all kinds of sense we put so much value on the struggle. Mm-hmm. And we dismiss what can come. We talk about this in terms of how we experience a day, right? We bring so much weight to the negative or to the difficult. And there could have been 8 things that happened that were quite lovely during that day that we don't pay attention to. Yeah. And so I think I'll just wrap up here and say that I want to thank you for bringing attention to questions of value and humanity, and being so upfront and giving of yourself in your experience and your arc of change, which I think is a really important way that we can view any kind of challenge. And that does not mean at any time would we ever wish that any suffering takes place or that any difficulty takes place, but the fact that there is access to joy that stretches beyond that experience. And you wrote down that you were able to put down the weapon against yourself toward the end, I think is something that we all can do for ourselves. And we hold ourselves to very, very high standards. And if we can connect on a level of humanity, we will all be the better for it. And this book is the impetus that I think many people will take in order to do that.
Thank you so much. That is unbelievably kind. And I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. So thank you for your generosity and your thoughtfulness and these brilliant questions. Thank you sincerely.